Hollywood didn't collapse in 1962. But for some films, it came dangerously close. What happens when million-dollar productions, legendary stars, and massive expectations all fail at once? Behind the glamour, something was breaking. Quietly, expensively, and publicly. In this video, we're uncovering 13 box office disasters that shook studios to their core. And by the end, one of these films nearly destroyed a Hollywood giant and changed how movies were made forever. The Interns, 1962. At first glance, The Interns looked perfectly timed. Medical dramas were gaining popularity, and audiences were becoming increasingly interested in the personal lives behind professional titles. The film promised intensity, pressure, and emotional conflict inside a hospital setting. But what it delivered felt overcrowded and unfocused. Instead of following a clear narrative, the story scattered its attention across too many characters. Each storyline felt rushed, never fully developing enough to create emotional investment. Viewers struggled to connect, and without that connection, tension quickly faded. Critics pointed out the lack of depth. Audiences quietly agreed. It wasn't a catastrophic financial collapse, but it was a clear misfire. The film had potential, but it never translated into momentum at the box office. In a year where audiences were becoming more selective, The Interns became an early signal of a changing industry. Rome Adventure, 1962. Rome Adventure had all the ingredients of a romantic success: exotic locations, European charm, and the promise of escapism. At a time when audiences still dreamed of travel and romance, this should have worked. But something felt distant. The film leaned heavily on scenery rather than substance. Beautiful landscapes filled the screen, but the emotional core remained shallow. Characters lacked urgency, and the pacing moved too slowly to hold attention. Viewers expected passion. What they received was detachment. Despite a respectable production budget and international appeal, the film struggled to generate strong box office returns. It wasn't offensive, it was forgettable. And in cinema, forgettable can be fatal. Rome Adventure revealed a subtle shift. Audiences were no longer satisfied with surface-level beauty. They wanted stories that moved, not just images that impressed. The film didn't fail loudly. It faded quietly. Hemingway's Adventures of a Young Man, 1962. Adapting Ernest Hemingway should have been a safe bet. His name carried weight, prestige, and literary credibility. Studios believed audiences would be drawn to the combination of classic storytelling and cinematic scale, but prestige does not guarantee engagement. Hemingway's Adventures of a Young Man struggled to translate its source material into a compelling film experience. The episodic structure made the story feel fragmented, as if viewers were watching disconnected moments rather than a cohesive journey. Even the presence of recognizable actors couldn't anchor the narrative. Critics noted that the film felt more like a literary exercise than a cinematic one. Audiences sensed the same problem. The emotional distance made it difficult to stay invested. Financially, and the film underperformed expectations. For a project built on a celebrated name, that gap mattered. This was one of those quiet disappointments that signaled something deeper. Hollywood was beginning to learn that audiences didn't come for reputation alone. They came for experience. And when that experience felt uneven, even the strongest names couldn't carry the weight. The Spiral Road, 1962. The Spiral Road was designed to feel important. Set against an exotic colonial backdrop, it carried the tone of a serious, thoughtful drama. Studios believed this kind of prestige storytelling would command attention. Instead, it tested patience. The film's pacing dragged under the weight of its own ambition. Scenes stretched longer than necessary, and the narrative lacked urgency. What should have felt immersive began to feel exhausting. Audiences disengaged. There was no single moment where the film collapsed. Instead, it slowly lost its grip, scene by scene. The emotional stakes never rose high enough to sustain interest, and the story struggled to justify its length. Critics described it as overlong and unfocused. At the box office, that translated into disappointment. The spiral road represents a specific kind of failure. One built on good intentions, but weakened by execution. It aimed for depth, but delivered distance. In a changing cinematic landscape, that distance became costly. Because by 1962, audiences were no longer willing to sit through films that demanded attention without rewarding it. A Majority of One, 1962. A Majority of One arrived with a meaningful premise. It explored cultural differences, human connection, and the possibility of understanding across boundaries. On paper, it had emotional depth. On screen, it felt constrained. The film never fully escaped its stage play origins. Dialogue dominated every scene, and the visual storytelling remained limited. Instead of feeling cinematic, it felt confined. Audiences noticed. While the themes were sincere, the execution lacked energy. The pacing slowed the narrative, and moments that should have felt powerful instead felt static. Viewers weren't drawn into the story. They observed it from a distance. At the box office, that distance translated into weak performance. This wasn't a failure of intent. It was a failure of adaptation. Hollywood had begun transitioning into a more visually dynamic era. Audiences expected movement, atmosphere, and cinematic immersion. A Majority of One offered something quieter, more restrained, and in doing so, it struggled to compete. The film serves as a reminder that good ideas are not enough. In cinema, how a story is told matters just as much as the story itself. Waltz of the Toreadors, 1962. Waltz of the Toreadors was not a typical mainstream film. It leaned into sophisticated humor, subtle character dynamics, and a tone that required patience. The studio likely believed this would appeal to more refined audiences. Instead, it created confusion. The film's humor didn't land with broader viewers. Its tone shifted unpredictably between comedy and introspection, making it difficult to categorize. Audiences weren't sure how to engage with it. Was it satire? Was it drama? That uncertainty worked against it. But critics were divided, but audiences were more decisive. They simply didn't show up in large numbers. The film's niche appeal limited its reach, and without strong word of mouth, it struggled to gain traction. Financially, it became another quiet disappointment. This kind of failure is easy to overlook because it lacks spectacle. There were no production disasters, no major controversies, just a film that didn't connect. But in many ways, that's more revealing, because it shows how fragile audience engagement can be. Even a well-crafted film can fail if it doesn't clearly communicate its identity. And in 1962, clarity was becoming increasingly important. The Couch, 1962. The Couch ventured into darker psychological territory. It explored themes that were uncomfortable, unsettling, and ahead of their time. As on paper, this could have created intrigue. In reality, it created resistance. Audiences in the early 1960s were not fully prepared for this kind of subject matter. The film's tone felt heavy, and its themes lacked the accessibility needed to draw in a wider audience. Curiosity turned into hesitation. Marketing struggled to position the film. It wasn't easy to sell, and without clear appeal, audiences chose safer options. The box office reflected that hesitation. Critics recognized the film's ambition, but questioned its execution. The psychological depth came at the cost of engagement. Scenes felt intense, but not always compelling. The result was a film that existed in an awkward space, too serious for casual viewers, yet not strong enough to attract niche audiences in large numbers. Financially, it underperformed. As The Couch highlights a recurring challenge in cinema: timing. A film can be innovative, but if it arrives before audiences are ready, that innovation can become a liability. In 1962, that gap between ambition and acceptance proved costly. My Geisha, 1962. My Geisha attempted something bold. It blended comedy with cultural themes and added a layer of disguise and identity. The concept had potential for both humor and commentary, but the execution sparked controversy. Casting choices became a focal point of criticism. Audiences questioned the authenticity, and what was intended as lighthearted storytelling began to feel uncomfortable. Instead of drawing viewers in, it pushed some away. The tone didn't help. The film struggled to balance its comedic elements with its more sensitive themes. At times it felt playful, at others awkwardly serious. That inconsistency made it difficult for audiences to fully engage. Box office performance reflected the tension. While not a complete collapse, the film failed to achieve the success the studio had anticipated. The gap between expectation and reality turned it into a disappointment. My Geisha reveals how quickly public perception can shift. What might have seemed acceptable in concept became problematic in execution. And once that perception changes, it becomes difficult to recover. In an era where Hollywood was beginning to face new cultural awareness, this film became an early example of how misjudgment could impact both reception and revenue. Jessica, 1962. Jessica had charm on its side, set in a picturesque environment with a light romantic tone. It seemed designed to attract audiences looking for escapism. But charm alone wasn't enough. The film struggled with identity. It couldn't fully commit to being a comedy or a drama, and that uncertainty weakened its impact. Scenes that should have been humorous lacked energy, while emotional moments failed to resonate deeply. Audiences felt the inconsistency. Without a clear tone, the story drifted. Viewers couldn't fully invest because the film never gave them a stable emotional direction. It felt uneven, and that unevenness translated into weak engagement. At the box office, the result was disappointing. Jessica didn't collapse dramatically. Instead, it quietly underperformed, overshadowed by stronger, more focused films of the time. This kind of failure is subtle but significant. That's because it demonstrates how important clarity is in storytelling. When a film doesn't know exactly what it wants to be, audiences often decide for it. And in most cases, they choose to walk away. The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm, 1962. This film was built as a spectacle. Shot in the complex Cinerama format, it promised audiences a visual experience unlike anything they had seen before. Technically, it delivered. Financially, it struggled. The production costs were enormous for the time. Elaborate sets, special effects, and experimental filming techniques pushed the budget higher and higher. The expectation was clear. This needed to be a major hit. It wasn't. While audiences appreciated the visual ambition, the storytelling felt uneven. The narrative structure lacked cohesion, and the film's pacing created distance rather than immersion. Spectacle couldn't compensate for that. Box office returns failed to match the investment. Even with decent attendance, the film couldn't recover its massive costs. That gap turned it into a financial disappointment. The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm represents a recurring Hollywood risk. Technology can attract attention, but it cannot replace storytelling. And when the balance leans too heavily towards spectacle, the consequences can be expensive. Taras Bulba, 1962. Taras Bulba aimed for epic scale. Vast battle sequences, sweeping landscapes, and a dramatic historical narrative gave it all the ingredients of a grand cinematic spectacle. On the surface, it looked like the kind of film designed to dominate theaters and leave a lasting impression. But scale comes with pressure. The production carried a significant budget, and with that came high expectations. This wasn't a film that could afford to perform modestly. It needed to succeed in a big way. Studios were counting on strong ticket sales to justify the investment. Instead, the results were mixed. While some viewers appreciated the film's visual ambition and large-scale action, others found the story lacking emotional depth. The characters never fully connected with audiences, and without that connection, the spectacle began to feel hollow. It was impressive to look at, but difficult to feel. Critics quickly noticed the imbalance. They pointed out that while the film delivered on scale, it struggled to deliver on storytelling. And in cinema, that difference matters more than it seems. Without strong emotional engagement, and word of mouth weakened, and once that momentum slowed, recovery became difficult. Financially, the film fell short of expectations. Taras Bulba wasn't an outright collapse, but it didn't generate the level of success its scale demanded. In Hollywood terms, that gap can be just as damaging. Because when a film invests heavily in spectacle, anything less than a clear victory begins to look like a loss. The Chapman Report, 1962. The Chapman Report tried to be bold. It explored themes that were rarely addressed openly in mainstream cinema at the time. The intention was to provoke discussion. Instead, it provoked discomfort. Audiences weren't ready for its approach. The film tackled sensitive subjects without the balance needed to maintain engagement. What was meant to feel daring came across as unsettling. Viewers reacted cautiously. Word of mouth didn't build. It weakened. The film struggled to attract repeat audiences, and without sustained interest, its box office performance declined. Critics were equally divided. Some acknowledged its ambition, but many pointed to its uneven execution. The storytelling lacked cohesion, and the tone shifted in ways that made it difficult to follow. Financially, it became a disappointment. The Chapman Report illustrates a key risk in filmmaking. Pushing boundaries can create impact, but without the right approach, it can also limit reach. And in 1962, that limitation came at a cost. Mutiny on the Bounty, 1962. This wasn't just a failure, it was a warning. Mutiny on the Bounty began as one of the most ambitious productions of its time. With a massive budget, international locations, and the star power of Marlon Brando, the film was expected to dominate the box office and reaffirm Hollywood's ability to create grand, unforgettable epics. Instead, it spiraled out of control. From the earliest stages of production, problems began to surface. Filming schedules slipped, weather conditions disrupted shooting, and creative disagreements slowed progress. Reports of tension on set only added to the uncertainty. What should have been a carefully managed production became unpredictable, and every delay pushed the budget higher. And every extra day meant more money. By the time filming finally wrapped, the budget had ballooned to staggering levels, making it one of the most expensive films ever produced at that time. The expectations surrounding its release were enormous. It didn't just need to succeed. It needed to dominate. When the film finally reached theaters, it performed, but not enough. Despite generating significant revenue, it failed to recover its full cost. The gap between gross earnings and actual profit became impossible to ignore. For the studio behind it, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the financial consequences were severe and long-lasting. This wasn't just a disappointing release, it was a destabilizing moment. Executives across Hollywood began to reconsider how large-scale productions were planned and controlled. Budgets, once flexible, became closely monitored. Risk, once accepted, became something to manage carefully. Mutiny on the Bounty didn't just fail. It forced Hollywood to confront the cost of ambition. And in doing so, it changed how movies were made. And some of these films didn't just lose money, they exposed the fragile illusion behind Hollywood's golden era. Massive budgets, legendary names, and grand ambition weren't enough to guarantee success anymore. So the real question is, how many guaranteed hits today are quietly heading toward the same fate? Because as history has shown, the bigger the film, the harder the fall.